Welcome to my May reading summary. So in this video I will be talking about some of the major highlights of what I read over May. So it's basically these books. And I will briefly be going over each of them, mentioning what I thought and what particularly I found valuable in each book. I won't be doing comments on them or analysis in detail because I will probably be planning to release some other videos which focuses individually on some of these books, and there isn't time to cover all of them in detail in this one video. So without further ado, I will start now. The first one I will be talking about is this one. It's called Mimesis, the Representation of Reality in Western Literature. This book has been on my to-read list like forever, and it takes you through various Anglo-European works all the way from Homer's Odyssey to Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. So this is the table of contents. But as the title suggests, it charts the development of how reality is represented in literature. So some examples that say from the very beginning in Homer's work, he discusses how fictional time is not always represented in a strictly linear way, like the pace of the story follows exactly like how the pace of the events actually occur, because in the Odyssey there's actually some interjections of like character recollections and memories that kind of breaks the flow of time. And then there are like some medieval works that it talks about how originally in the very beginning of the medieval tradition, most of the tales focus on like action scenes, like chivalric knighthood stories, but then there was this movement towards showing more domestic scenes. That was a shift. And then another major shift was the French realist tradition. The book kind of focuses on writers like Zola and Flaubert, and they were the ones who were first able to bring the fourth estate into kind of major literary roles for the first time in literary history. I would say for this work, because it draws heavily on a lot of works from earlier periods like medieval, even before that, and they were a lot of the periods I wasn't particularly the most familiar with, so I sort of like skipped around a little, and particularly they were more European works which I wasn't as familiar with compared to like the Anglo-Saxon literary tradition. So I would say I read like 70% of it. I skipped around a little, but overall it was really informative and interesting, especially to read analysis on works that I haven't read themselves. So the next one I'm mentioning is Katherine Mansfield, The Collected Stories. I will leave a link below because I actually have a video which already covers all her stories, so if you're interested, check that out. I won't repeat what I said in this video again. Next one is The Heart of the Matter by Graham Greene. So this is actually the first Graham Greene book that I've read. I've kind of wanted to try him for a long time, and I just came across this at one of the secondhand books that was really cheap, so I bought it. So as a plot summary, it's about this English police officer called Scobie, who's stationed at one of the posts in colonial West Africa, and the book kind of makes it a bit ambiguous precisely where he's stationed at. What I liked the most about this book was its intertwining of various themes, including religion, personal responsibility, human connections, conscience, and like the meaning of life. So basically Scobie is someone who's characterized as having like a really passive, lethargic or pessimistic view on life, as in he just kind of carries on and he feels like everything is fundamentally meaningless. He just carries on due to his sort of religious conviction that it's too sinful for a Catholic to commit suicide. And he lives with this huge burden of duty on his conscience for his wife Louise and later for his mistress Helen. And throughout the novel we see him as someone who's like entrapped by his own sense of duty and conscience. Like he would not accept bribes like everyone else, he would not do illegal stuff, he would not profit off any of the illegal stuff, he doesn't care about promotion. Like his wife really wants him to become the commissioner, but he doesn't care, precisely because he is so like having a lack of enthusiasm or passion about life. That is why he feels like he doesn't desire any of those wealth or benefits that he could procure by cheating on others or doing like bribery and like doing not like pretty dodgy stuff. There's this combination that he has no desire for anything in life, and his sense of duty which arises out of his religious beliefs, which makes him live in such a tortured state, and it's a story about how he grapples with it. However, I think one thing about the book was that it dragged on too long. So sometimes authors, it's an amazing concept. He's done this concept in a really rich and intertwined way that I really appreciated, but he could have done it in like 2/3 or half the length of this book. So towards like the end, I kind of got a bit frustrated because it was really repetitive. Like, I'm already catching on to the message, you could have shortened it. So this is one critique of Green, and I think this critique would be applicable to a lot of people. The next one is this, Notes from Underground and a lot of Selected Criticism, the Norton Critical Edition. So I've actually read Dostoevsky's book like a year or so ago, but I came across this in the bookstore and I just loved Notes from Underground. It's actually one of my favorite books ever. So I bought it and I kind of dived into those criticism because it's very interesting. So basically, the protagonist of the book, known as the Underground Man, is a retired civil servant, and this book is divided into two parts. The first one is his internal monologue discussing like a lot of grand philosophical ideals, in particular criticizing the rise of utilitarianism or scientific rationalism in Europe and how that's like penetrating the intellectual circles in Russia. So he didn't like that because he thinks it has like detrimental effects on people's free will and to just act according to the whims and not having to positively do what is considered like most rational or beneficial. And then the second part of the book discusses his life 20 years ago when he was still working as the civil servant. It's filled with episodes where he kind of expresses spite to those around him, in particular to his group of friends and to this prostitute that he meets. So there are like a lot of collected criticism at the back, and it's like a ton, and I will just talk about a few that I really enjoyed and stood out to me. The first one is called Discourse in Dostoevsky by Bardin, and its central focus is on the writing style, how the first person narrator is sort of writing it in a form of like a dialogue, and he always likes to leave the last word to himself because he's always like anticipating opposition and he wants to dispel any possible opposition before it could rise, and that kind of like reflects his lack of self-confidence, etc. So that was a very brief and inconclusive summary. And the next one is called Freedom in Notes from Underground by Robert Louis Jackson. This one, yeah, as it says, it talks about freedom. So as I said, it discusses one of the central themes of this book, which is about the impact of this rationalist worldview on free will, how people don't have the ability to just act according to their whims instead of to some dictated natural law of what is best for humans to do. And then the next one, by one author, there's two works. So there's The Pun of Creativity and Double Determination. So this is by Gary Saul Mawson. So The Pun of Creativity, it basically talks about how the underground man tries to say how he wants to have free will and have like open possibilities in life, and this rationalist worldview stopping him from doing so. But it's like ironic how when he puts himself in this persona of like the spiteful man, he's actually limiting his own freedom, even though that's exactly what he's argued against. And Double Determination is like a really short piece that basically says stuff about how you can never have any sort of closure in real life, but in literature you do have closure, and however that sort of closure is something that's given externally, like in the meta-literary level, by the author who closes the work, not by the character. So in a sense, even though the underground man tries to be free, it's kind of like Dostoevsky hovering over him and says he can't be free. And then the last person's criticism I'm going to talk about is Joseph Frank. So he wrote this book on Dostoevsky, and there is one chapter in it called Notes from Underground, and it basically analyzes the work kind of part by part and chapter by chapter. And one of the most significant parts in this piece of criticism that stood out to me was its discussion of Dostoevsky's character's treatment of spite. So when there's like laws of nature that makes any sort of responsibility impossible because no one has free will, so no one can be responsible, how can someone take revenge on anyone? No one can be blamed for anything they do. So the answer here is then it would only be out of spite. Spite is not a valid cause for any kind of action, and hence it is the only one left when the laws of nature make any justified response impossible. So yeah, I really love Norton Critical Editions because they collect such nice criticism on works, and it's like I don't have to go scourge JSTOR for just random stuff that I don't know if they're gonna make sense or not. The next book is called On Solitude by Montaigne. So this is part of the Penguin Great Ideas tradition, which I totally love. It's actually composed of a lot of essays by him, and On Solitude is kind of like the signature one, but this is like the entire contents. And I think On Solitude is also my favorite one because it makes so much sense. It's such a good take on life because he says it's not about living physically alone, but more like you have to keep a sort of room inside one's mind which is reserved just for the self, and it's somewhere you can retreat to, and it's kind of like your anchor in this world. And each person should aspire to have that. And I think one of the best quotes from it is, it says, "It is not enough to withdraw from the mob, not enough to go to another place. We have to withdraw from such attributes of the mob as are within us. It is our own self we have to isolate and take back into possession." I really enjoyed that essay, but everything else, I would say some of them I didn't really connect with, because he kind of talked extensively on a lot of like ancient historical allusions and anecdotes, which not to mention I don't really know what those historical events in like very, very ancient times were meant to be. Sometimes I don't even know what the people are, so I was a bit confused. And in some works he says really weird stuff, like in like on books he says, my design is to spend whatever life I have left gently and unlaboriously. I'm not prepared to bash my brains for anything, not even for learning's sake, however precious it may be. From books all I seek is to give myself pleasure by an honourable pastime. So he's like, don't study, which okay, I would love to do, but he only has the leisure to do so because he's like this rich landowner's son who didn't have to do anything, honestly. And then he says some even weirder stuff in like on the power of imagination, where he says there's a lot of cases when one's like belief or conviction or imagination cause like miraculous stuff to happen. And that one I was really concerned and I was really confused when I was reading it. And there are other titles like on fear, on sadness, on anger, and I kind of read them as just pretty like common sense discussions about what those emotions are and how they influence us, adding in a bit of like historical anecdotes. I would say the highlight of this book is just on Solitude. I really, really enjoyed that essay, and everything else is just meh, it's just alright and some a bit weird. The next one I'm going to talk about, and the last one, is Virginia Woolf, The Complete Short Stories. So she's much more well known for her novels, which I have read most of them, but I haven't read her like shorter fiction much. And when I came across that at like those secondhand book stands, I'm just like, interesting, I'll try that. And I'm very glad I tried, because some stories, they're just amazing strokes of geniuses. I think I'm definitely going to make another video like exploring them in detail, but let me just mention a few of the ones that I really, really liked. And most of them are like so short, it's just like a few pages. Pretty sure like if anyone's interested you can just find them online as in like an audiobook or PDF. The first one is a very early story and it's called The Mysterious Case of Miss V. It's literally 2.5 pages. So it's about a certain Miss V in the neighborhood of the narrator who has died recently, and it expresses how living alone in a modern city renders one such an insignificant presence that one escapes others' notice daily and even in death. And it's kind of like the ease with which such a fate befalls you suggests that it is really necessary to assert yourself in order to prevent yourself from being skipped. And this particularly, I feel like it still rings really powerful, especially for our contemporary lives, where it's like we hear news of people living alone found dead in their apartments like 2 weeks later. And it's just saying how people are just so forgotten and ignored as individuals in a big city. The next one, called Solid Objects, is a bit longer and it's really interesting because it's basically about a man called John who's obsessed with like collecting rocks and hence like the solid objects. And his joy is basically collecting rocks, which other people don't understand him because he doesn't enjoy like all the other things most people in society enjoy. He's kind of gradually going into like social and political seclusion. And then it ends with like his friend Charles, who became like this actively political figure, and he visits John and he just said he wouldn't visit him again because he doesn't understand him. And I think this is actually a satire of how most people in society pursue objects that are not even solid, like fame, wealth, status, popularity, those kind of stuff, that it seems really ridiculous that someone's obsessed with a solid object, rocks. But doesn't it seem like even more ridiculous that people are obsessed with things that are not even like existent? Next one's called The Man Who Loved His Kind. So this one is basically about a man who claims that he has so much affection for humankind, and because of that he felt compelled to devote all his time and energy into efforts that improve others, like charity work, etc. But in the meantime, through his conversation with this woman, we realize that he's actually forgotten or is unable to recognize the simple beauties and joys in reading. So because books kind of like carry the ingenuity and emotions of humanity, and appreciating like nature and arts. So the question is, does he truly love humankind, or if he does love humankind, is this sort of like impeding his ability to love and appreciate a lot of other like beautiful and important stuff in the world and in society. One of the later works, again, it's really short, it's like just over 3 pages, but it's so powerful. 3 pictures is basically divided into 3 parts, and each part is kind of like a picture. So it presents a distant observer's perspective on a sailor who's returned home to his wife, and the three-part kind of like are fragments from different observations throughout a period of 2 weeks. We see how through such distant lenses we're able to realize that something of profound grief and death happened. And I think what really powerfully touches us is the distance with which it is presented, and how we get the sense that a lot of the times like huge things change in other people's lives, but we only have tiny glimpses of. The next story is a very inventive one. It's called Lapin and Lapinova, and it's slightly longer than the other ones. So it's from the perspective of a married woman. So she likes to kind of imagine herself and her husband as rabbits, calling him Lapin and herself Lapinova. So this creation of her imagination is kind of like her mechanism for allowing their marriage to temporarily escape the confines of social protocol and the strict demands given by her husband's extended family. So it kind of preserves a sort of like romanticism and love and purity in their marriage by comparing themselves to like rabbits, and like their love is something that's pure between animals. But in the end, it's kind of like there's this really surrealist scene where she realizes she's like sitting in the living room and surrounded by all those like social formalities, and in the end she realizes that the rabbit kind of died in her husband, and so it's like she's forced to resign to her position in a human society, and their love kind of loses their otherworldly pureness. So in summary, these are the highlights of what I've read over May, and I do plan to make some videos talking about some of the really interesting works. I hope this video has given you some ideas of interesting books to explore, and if you do enjoy it, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe.